right, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome, not in terms of temperature, but in terms of the emotion of the heart.
Yeah.
So not only the ones who made it through the storm and were brave enough to come here, but also the other brave people who joined online. So very much welcome to you as well. Hey, my name, for the ones who don't know, I'm Harry Wells, and I am part of this wonderful institute called the African Studies Center Leiden. A very warm welcome, of course, to our guest speaker for today and dear colleague from the University of Western Cape, Dr. Sharyn Spicer, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of the Western Cape. This seminar is an initiative from the collaborative research group Trans-Species Perspectives on African Studies, which basically, and I mean, I repeat for the people who have been more familiar with what the collaborative research groups have been doing, we kind of try to challenge the anthropocentrism that seems so prevalent in African studies. Sharyn fits very well in that kind of profile to argue for the reasons why we should maybe challenge that kind of perspective. Herself is also quite actively involved on the same mission, if I may call it that way. So we know each other already for a while. Actually, it's I don't know, but we're talking years at least. Sharyn is famous maybe for being in this kind of paradigm shift conversation, but at UWC she is really incredibly famous for another project, which I have to mention here, which has to do with human-animal relations as well, but it's about feral cats because they were a nuisance, so people were even trying to park their car, and then they were more or less attacked or annoyed by cats. And it's a huge campus, so there are, I don't know how many feral cats were walking around in various stages of good health or bad health, or nice fur, not so nice fur, and all that. And Sharyn came up with the idea to kind of treating them as a nuisance, throwing stones and, you know, kicking them or whatever, to take an attitude of care, to give them home, food, and medical care. And if you are on the UWC campus, I really invite you to visit it once or even more times. You see all kinds of locations, villages, where cats are housed, where they are fed, where there is medical kind of facilities. And in return, the cats have really become much more nice to people. But even more nice is that they also work together with people to get, or no, to keep, maybe that's the better wording, to keep the mice, the numerous mice on campus a bit under control. So in a way, the money spent on the cats is also repaid in a way by a reciprocal kind of deed of keeping the mice under control. And that is all because of Sharyn's initiative. If I'm not mistaken, was it started in 2011?
Yeah, 2009 actually.
9 years.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. So it's still running, on that note, back to this seminar, which will follow a very classic traditional structure. Sharyn speaks for some 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Then there is a Q&A, and how long that takes we will see, because it stands between us and drinks. So you never know how by that time that influences our willingness to engage in very deep the conversations. The title of Sharyn's lecture, Animals in Africa, Human-Animal Relationships Through, and here comes the unexpected part, at least for me, because I know Sharyn for the human-animal stuff, I know about Africa a bit and all that, but then through the lenses of decoloniality and Ubuntu, which makes me incredibly curious. Sharyn, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invite, for giving me this opportunity, and for attending despite the storm warning. I appreciate having your presence. So, yeah, thank you. That's exactly right. If I can just start off by just giving a bit of, Harry's already given me a great intro, but just to say that my interest in this topic is both academic, but also stems from my personal involvement in animal welfare for many decades now. So that said, I can make no bones about the fact that I have an agenda, and my agenda is to assist animals in every way possible, which has led me to think all the ways that ideas can be changed. And when I was thinking about this, it became apparent that the only way that we're going to change people's perceptions about animals in South Africa is if we engage with sectors of the population who have been excluded from these kinds of considerations. And it's no secret that animal welfare and animal protectionism is dominated by certain demographics, and we know this. And because I have this agenda, and because I'm interested in advancing animal welfare, I suddenly realized that the only way that this is going to change is if we somehow include an African ethic or an African belief system that will make it more palatable to the majority of the population. So I'm by no means in any way an expert. How can I be on decoloniality or Ubuntu? However, I have to be reasonably proficient in these concepts, proficient enough to see their validity and application to what is essentially my agenda. So it's a combination of research interests and my animal welfare background. And I am a sociologist, so and I'm straddling two worlds, and I'm also in a discipline that's not exactly the most open to these kinds of ideas, to put it mildly. There are many other disciplines, anthropology, psychology, history, English, that are much, much more open to looking at human-animal interactions than my own discipline. However, and as a result, there's huge gaps in research within sociology that need to be addressed. So part of this agenda that I have requires practical application of theoretical and philosophical ideas, because my ultimate aim is to transform animal welfare for various reasons. And the only way it can be transformed, everything starts with an idea. And by I'm hoping that through the infusion of these ideas, people will start to look at animal protectionism in a new way. So this conversation around decolonization is very much the topic of the moment in South Africa. However, this conversation has only started in the veterinary and animal welfare sector, if at all. It's very, very new, and people within those sectors are not used to having conversations about underlying philosophies and ethics, etc. Although this analysis and discussion is applicable to all animal species, because of the nature of the empirical research that I've been involved in, a lot of my examples will apply specifically to, and here comes another contentious issue, to pets. And I mean, for lack of another word, I don't really know what other word to use. We've been through this so many times, and I'm aware of the controversy. I'm aware of the contentious nature, but I'm using the word because I don't have a better word to use at this point. Companion animals just does not fit the bill in any way with regard to many of the relationships people have with their animals in South Africa. So it's necessary, I think, to have this conversation because policies, teaching, oh goodness me, I've forgotten that I have slides, and research agendas are often made on assumptions made in the global north, and this results in embedded inequities. Apart from these academic imperatives and addressing the lacuna within South African sociological literature, there's a very real crisis in South Africa at the moment, specifically with regard to dogs and cats. We talk about an overpopulation, but more than an overpopulation, it's not really that there's too many in terms of the space, it's that there's too many in terms of the kind of care that's been offered. And as a result, the amount of animals that are being euthanized on a daily basis is absolutely staggering. And I think the only way to address this problem is to get to the roots of it. And when you start to look at, because at the end of the day, as a social sociologist, I can see that the reason that there's a problem facing dogs in the country, and dogs and cats in the country, it's directly linked to human social issues like unemployment, homelessness, and even things like HIV. I mean, if I could just give you an example, in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, in the rural areas where there was a large sector of the population infected with HIV, what actually happened in those rural areas, as HIV spread, so the stray dog population increased. Because what would happen is people would die, and then they would leave their dogs, and then those dogs would sort of be left to fend for themselves, and they would form packs with other dogs. And packs of dogs like this, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, then led to an increase in rabies. So there's a direct link between HIV and rabies because of this stray dog thing. So I think by drawing these connections, we start to see what is essentially an animal problem as a much broader human problem. And I think when you reframe that, the kind of policies and solutions you come up with are going to be somewhat quite different. The argument that I'm trying to make, apart from trying to convince people that it's necessary to look at these issues, is to re-examine and ultimately transform existing animal protection and welfare structures. Because many of these animal welfare organizations, and certainly the sort of ethos that is dominant within them, developed within the Victorian era. It's always in the late 1800s that all these movements came into being. So obviously these organizations that emerge within a context of the Victorian era, the colonial era, are going to be infused with these kinds of ideas. So if you look at the kind of beliefs that people have, not only about animals, but people's relationships with them, incredibly outdated and quite judgmental from this Victorian point of view. So I think the way we're going to have to transform it is to challenge and interrogate these very dated ideas.
Yeah, you can microwave. Or you use the arrows.
Oh, the arrows, okay. Aha, there we go. In order to redress and possibly reinvent animal welfare, we need to go back to its roots. And when we go back to its roots, we find that animal protectionism did not evolve, as many people might think, alongside the environmental movement. Animal protectionism has its roots in much broader social movements like the suffragettes and women trying to get the vote in England, and more importantly, in the child protection movement. So these movements have a common origin. And I'm thinking that if we can retrace these roots and go back to this common origin, it will help give more credibility to the animal protection movement if people know how it evolved alongside other broader social issues. So on the one hand, you've got people like me who are trying to re-examine the roots of animal protectionism and try to show how it's worked parallel with certain human protection movements. But even within the animal welfare community, and yes, maybe not so much in South Africa, we often take our cues from the global north, and it's not always a bad thing. What we're seeing happening in America, for example, is that the animal welfare movement is moving in a new direction, and they're starting to take human social issues very, very seriously, because they've identified that it is these very issues that underlie animal cruelty and animal violence. So if you want to deal with violence against animals, if you want to deal with these issues, you cannot look at it separate from human social problems, and not just look at it separate from human social problems. You've actually got to do something active to mediate and assist and alleviate human social problems, because indirectly that's going to help the animals, which are the main cause. So moral and ethical theories that address human obligations to animals need to be reinvestigated. So when it comes to decolonization, like with everything else, if we want to move into a new future, everything starts with an idea. We first have to imagine that future. And at the end of this presentation, when I stop talking about the more theoretical, abstract ideas, I will present some of the more practical steps that can be taken to enact what I've been speaking about. So I've already said there's a common history between human social welfare and animal protectionism. And many of you probably, I don't know if you know or you don't know, but the laws, I mean, in South Africa and everywhere, the laws that protect animals, in many cases, preceded the laws that protect children. So the very first child abuse case that was ever brought forward in the United States was actually brought forward by the American SPCA, because there were no laws protecting children. So the SPCA were called out to a farm where a horse was being abused, and on this farm they saw a child that was clearly being abused and neglected. But they didn't know what to do because there was no legislation protecting children. So they went to court and used the animal protection laws to protect this child. They won the case, and in the process, after winning this case, the first organization for the protection of children emerged, as well as the humane societies, which look at in the interests of animals and children. So animal protectionism and child welfare have got a common history, a shared history, and even more than that, indirectly, animals actually, and animal welfare legislation actually ensured that child welfare and child protectionism actually came into the public domain. This was the case of this child called Mary Ellen Wilson. So the roots of early animal protectionism can be traced to slavery abolition, the suffrage movement, anti-vivisection, and child protection societies, not the environmental movement, as many people, as your common knowledge would get you to imagine. And on this note, some of you may be aware that just last month, the United Nations introduced a clause which has now made it a contravention of children's rights. Animal abuse is a contravention of children's rights. So if a child is subjected to animal abuse, that's seen as a contravention of the rights of the child. And it may sound like a small step, but it's actually a huge step, because it's brought animal abuse and animal cruelty firmly into the human domain. So these linkages and seeing animal protectionism as a social justice issue is no longer something that would be considered way out and on the fringe. When you look at the shared history of these movements, it no longer seems like such a crazy notion. And this is just the case I was telling you about. So the situation in South Africa today, as I mentioned, there's a lot going on with regard to animals. There's, apart from the negative, there's also quite a lot of reform going on. There's a lot of lawyers that have got together, they call themselves animal law reform, and they're busy trying to challenge the laws that still classify animals as property, and trying to find some sort of improvement to their legal status in the hope that this will change the way people think about animals and the way people treat animals. But it's still in its infancy, but there have been a couple of judgments, very progressive judgments recently by the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in South Africa, which have been very progressive in terms of protecting animal rights. what is a strange contradiction is that the organization tasked with protecting animals is the SPCA, the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, and they are the sort of dominant, most powerful movement in South Africa. Yet they are the ones who are opposing these legislative improvements. So the SPCA's position is, we don't need to change the law. The law is perfectly fine. It's a matter of enforcement. Then you've got animal activists saying, but how can the law be adequate? Because animal protection legislation, anti-cruelty laws, were never developed to protect animals. The reason why we have animal laws protecting animals is to protect people. So the fact that somebody like myself could get upset at witnessing animal cruelty is why these laws exist, to protect me from being upset. It's the cruelty of the animal is it doesn't matter. It's to protect the human who may be upset at having to visibly experience animal cruelty. To the extent that I think the law was only changed in France very recently, whereby if you abuse an animal, it's only against the law if it's done in public. But if it's done privately and nobody witnesses it, then nobody's been offended, then there's no need for the law to exist. So the question to the SPCA would be, how can a law that was never developed to protect animals in the first place be deemed adequate today? Obviously, this is a lot about politics and about privileged position, etc., and protecting territory, and nothing really to do with the rationale underlying this protection legislation. So despite the economic downturn and despite huge cultural variation in South Africa, we can honestly say that the keeping of pets, predominantly dogs and cats, is pretty much something that you will experience in all communities, across the board, all sectors of the population, rural, urban, you name it. It's kind of something that everybody is involved in to some extent. But there are, of course, great differences in terms of people, and we spoke a little bit about that in the masterclass, about how different people have different perceptions, and often these perceptions are not what your common sense is going to tell you it is with regard to animals. And this all ends up in a situation whereby masses and masses of animals are just being surrendered every single day to these welfare organizations, not stray or unowned, but animals that are actually owned that people are handing in. When I was at the SPCA with my students last week, they told me that they're putting down a minimum of 6,000 a week. And that's a lot of animals to be putting down in a week. I mean, can you actually imagine 6,000 dogs, how many that is? And that's just one organization in one town. So clearly there's a problem. And the problem is not going to be sorted out through building more shelters and just warehousing animals. The problem's not going to be sorted out by trying to increase adoptions, because there's only so many homes that can adopt. And you can't kill any more than you're already killing, because the consequences of this mass euthanasia of healthy animals also has a very negative effect on the people that are actually doing this. And so you'll find these organizations have an incredibly high turnover of staff, because imagine you, the person that's got to look after this animal, you develop a relationship with it, and then you're told you've got to go and kill it. That's going to, obviously, if you're human in any way, it's going to have some kind of negative psychological impact. So I think many people are at a point where we realize you can't build more welfare societies, you can't build more kennels, you can't increase adoptions. So what is the only thing you can do is to try and prevent animals being surrendered in the first place. And the way you can do that is if you start to see it as part of a broader human problem. Why do people surrender their animals? Homelessness, unemployment, illness, all divorce, all these kind of social issues are the reasons why people can no longer take care of their animals. So it stands to reason, if we can address these social problems somehow, we can prevent the animals being surrendered at the rate that they are. So there's also been a shift in public opinion regarding other animals. The public, if you look in the public domain and media reports, etc., there definitely is some kind of shift that's taking place. It's small, but people are becoming more aware of animals and their needs and their right to exist. as a result, we've seen a proliferation of organizations. But what is interesting is that in the past, you could say absolutely without generalization, totally and utterly, these organizations were spearheaded and started predominantly by white middle-class people, predominantly women. But when you look at it today in South Africa, what you are seeing is things are changing, and you are finding more and more organizations being started by Black people, for Black people, in Black areas. So this immediately changes the dynamic. It's no longer people coming from outside and prescribing to people how they should or shouldn't treat their animals. It's happening within the communities themselves. And I think that's certainly one of the things that needs to be encouraged if we want to talk about a decolonization project involving animals. That's just a picture of a recent storm we had in Cape Town recently, and just to sort of give you an indication of how animals are living. You can see how people are living. Now, if people are living like that, you can only imagine how animals are living. So, before talking about before advocating for a decolonial animal future, I think we need to talk a little bit about what colonialism meant for other animals. So in South Africa and elsewhere, during the colonial era, we saw that many intertwined processes and beliefs exacerbated the human separation from nature. Things like agriculture, industrialization, urbanization, and modernization, combined with religious and scientific ideas and concepts, provided a privileged status for humans. And this privileged status for humans was commonly held in all the colonies. So we can say that colonialism played a major role in imparting very problematic Western ideals as the dominant and prevailing worldview. And much of our relationships, humanity's relationships with the rest of the natural world, including animal species today, has been molded by this colonial experience. And colonialism, if we think about it, has been characterized by violence, inequality, exploitation, and domination. Therefore, it's no shock that if the animal movement evolved in this context, that it's going to be influenced by these kinds of ideas that were dominant. So the Eurocentric notion of dualism, which separates humanity from nature and other animals, is pretty much the backbone of colonialism. And through this, coloniality continues to uphold social, environmental, and animal injustice. These dualistic ideas are used to justify not only conquering people, but also ecosystems and other animal species. We talk about things like reason, language, and autonomy that we can typically only attribute to human animals, therefore validating the exclusion of the other. But now people are starting to talk about decolonization. So decolonization would imply the undoing or unraveling of colonialism. So now we know what colonialism is about, what is decolonization about? So I think in a nutshell, it's about developing independence and dismantling the so-called pillars of Western civilization, and particularly the oppression that they impart, the oppression that has been imparted by this. So it's a denunciation of the dominant systems of power, seeking to confront and de-link from Eurocentrism and contemporary colonial legacies, and in the process, imagining alternative solutions by enabling diverse ways of knowing and being. So a transformation or dismantling of the systems underlying coloniality is needed for radical intersectional justice and for the liberation of all oppressed life. Because the destructive nature of human-animal relations is firmly entrenched in coloniality. So decolonial thought could be a fundamental tool for dismantling and reimagining these relations. But the interconnections between oppression and exploitation of humans and other animals needs to be stressed for this project to have traction. Unfortunately, activity and dialogue around animal protectionism and animal activism is fraught with racism and entrenched in colonial thinking. So in order to draw people who have not historically been involved in animal welfare into the movement, we first got to tackle the racism that's inherent in the movement. And that's no easy task, particularly in a South African context. So we need to consider using decolonial frameworks that actively undo oppressive systems and ways of thinking. It's a disruptive approach. It's going to alter and challenge the status quo. And whenever anything challenges the status quo, obviously there's resistance. I mean, the SPCA won't even agree that there's a problem with the law. Imagine how they're going to feel about a decolonial disruptive project that challenges the status quo within animal welfare. But it's the ideal tool for exploring concepts underlying coloniality and how we can displace them. It's a way of unthinking Western knowledge and its foundational assumptions. And it has a pivotal role to address and tackle the problems that I'm talking about in this presentation. Because the persistent use of animal welfare models that are premised on colonial ideas are not solving the problem. They're actually adding to the problem. So the only way of solving the problem is to go back to these colonial ideas that underlie animal welfare and protectionism and to challenge these ideas. And that sounds a lot easier than it actually is. So this brings me to the concept of Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu is a sort of it's quite a sort of, how can I say, quite a general term, but it's also a term that's embraced by many African cultures, not just in South Africa. It's quite a broad term, even though its origin is in Nguni language group. And it's basically a term for a common or shared humanity that emphasizes the interrelatedness of humans, the environment, God, and the ancestors. And the basic idea is that human well-being is essentially dependent on the community, the broader community. They talk about a web of relationships. And this seems to be quite a lot of debate. You've got scholars on the one hand who are arguing that Ubuntu is essentially an anthropocentric concept that was developed only to apply to humanists. But then you've got a lot of scholars, and African scholars included, who are saying no. The concept of Ubuntu is actually a really wide concept, and it can be applied to include non-human others. And I think this idea is gaining quite a lot of traction at the moment. So the human connection with other animals in the surrounding environment has played a pivotal role in African ontology and identity. So Ubuntu premises the community as an organic whole that is not restricted to human society, and the concept can be extended to include also the spiritual and natural world. And it's like, yes, there may be a hierarchy with God and the ancestors being at the top and humans in the middle and animals at the bottom. But nevertheless, despite the hierarchy, the fact remains that the concept allows us to include non-human others in our sphere of reference and into our sphere of moral concern. So the traditional African philosophical idea is based on the collective sense of responsibility. And as such, it's part of what has been termed sort of indigenous knowledge systems. And it's definitely gaining traction in academia, but in politics and in society as a whole. So Ubuntu prescribes a particular kind of way of treating the natural world and animals. It regulates people's behavior because it's basically saying that it's not only humans that need to be part of our moral concern. We need to extend this, and through use of this concept, all we need to do is bring others into our community of concern who haven't been there before. And in the process, make an inference that because these non-human others are now part of our moral concern, it means that we cannot treat them as we will. So while Ubuntu appears to be an inherent protector of nature and other animals, we cannot over-romanticize the concept and portray a misconception that it holds absolute intrinsic reverence for other than human life, seeing it as equal. It's nowhere close to that. However, it's a start. It gives us something that's not coming from outside, something that's got its origin on the African continent, and an idea that many people subscribe to, and it's putting the idea into people's minds that just by extending this concept slightly, we can have a shift in the way that we view and treat other animal species. Interestingly enough, as some scholars have pointed out, this idea of Ubuntu is not necessarily guided by a love for nature and animals, but often by fear, that if you treat the natural world and animals in a particular way, the gods will not be favorable towards you. So a fear of the ancestors and a fear of the gods is often what regulates and constrains people's behavior, rather than this concept that nature or animals have inherent value. It's the fear of upsetting the gods, but nevertheless. So inadvertently, Ubuntu can lead to a level of respect and protection of nature that is and value afforded to other than human life. Forgotten about the slides again. The argument is that the coloniality and systemic racism experienced by Africans can open a door of empathy through which reflection can be invited on the oppression and exploitation of the other as it relates to nature or other species. So species-based emancipation can be argued for on the same moral grounds on which transformation opposing oppression and subjugation of humans based on race and gender was. We're not by any means trying to parallel these experiences, but we are saying the same logic and the same argument that was used to dismantle pillars of oppression in other spheres can be used to dismantle animal oppression. So Ubuntu may not have a completely ready offer to challenge and remedy problematic and dominant Western ways which harm humans, other animals, and the environment, but it can provide the groundwork for an inclusive moral system to be developed. Because cultural traditions and practice, as we know, are neither static nor fixed. They are adaptable. They adjust as contexts and circumstances change. So too is Ubuntu. Ubuntu is also dynamic. It can be extended. It can be used to include others who have been historically excluded. Despite the anthropocentric undertone, it's probably the best we have at the moment in order to include the rest of nature. There's deep value in the ecological wisdom and intelligence that can be found in indigenous cultures, and the concept of Ubuntu brings this into focus. So by restoring Ubuntu and its emphasis on universal interrelatedness and interdependence, it is hoped that this ethic can extend moral consideration to those who've been excluded, namely other animals. It provides an alternative to the Western rationality program, where nature is presented as only having value if it serves human interests. Because Ubuntu's traditional cosmology promotes environmental awareness and conscience by providing an integrated model that can uphold the value of both humans and animals within a shared ecosystem. And heeding the call for a restoration of Ubuntu can influence the way people act towards all other life around them. By removing dualistic thinking and moving beyond knowledge confined to ideas of science on the one hand, indigenous beliefs on the other hand, nature and culture on the other hand, by moving beyond that, it's hoping that dialogue and collaboration between Western scientists and people with indigenous knowledge, which has been sort of relegated to the margins, that together some kind of holistic ethical pedagogy could emerge. So the restoration of Ubuntu does not mean resorting to restoring pre-colonial ways of life. The world has changed too drastically to even consider turning back the clock. But the call looks to invite Ubuntu to create new ways of living in contemporary Southern Africa that are inspired by this African cosmology. So it emphasizes relationships and independence as fundamental in the well-being of communities as a whole. In the broad sense, community is extended beyond the realm of living beings to include nature and the spirit world. While much of the world's ethical ideas around the environment are shaped by hierarchical dualistic thinking, Ubuntu is the antithesis. It brings these things together and says there is no separation. It's a shared common experience. And if we recognize the shared common experience, immediately it starts to shift the way we see non-human others. And in a way, it can become an ethical guide that extends beyond the human realm. So therefore, a restoration of Ubuntu, we are hoping, can usher in a balance in relations between humanity and the rest of nature, which includes other animals. So coloniality is deeply entrenched in the narrative of the destructive nature of the human-animal nature relationship. Therefore, decolonial thought needs to reimagine relations between humans and the rest of the natural world. So what is required essentially is a transformation of the systems of domination and exploitation which underlie colonialism. It needs to be dismantled. So it's quite a radical approach that's been proposed, because it's kind of moving away from the very origins and very roots of animal protectionism and saying these roots are actually discriminatory, and in order to reach a broader audience and in order to change the way people look at animal protectionism, you've actually got to reframe it. And by using concepts like decoloniality and Ubuntu, you can reframe this whole movement. So the indigenous Southern African philosophy of Ubuntu arguably offers a possible framework with which to do so. But it requires, as I said, it's a paradigm shift, which requires a shift in consciousness. And it's going to be opposed because people have vested interests. But by recognizing and addressing patterns entrenched in colonial thinking, and the intersectionality of oppression is the first step in this journey. By using a decoloniality approach grounded in indigenous knowledge that is informed by and inclusive of other critical theories, focusing on ideas like intersectionality and non-anthropocentrism, it is hoped that we can open the way to at least start talking about these issues in a new way. There's clearly deep value in the ecological wisdom and intelligence that can be found in these indigenous cultures and indigenous knowledge systems. So why not draw them out and use them? The only reason to not do so would be ideological. So it seems that Ubuntu resists Western philosophical discourse that denies African contributions to knowledge and practice. And it offers a thought system that's rooted in indigenous cultural knowledge, but something that could advance the welfare of all and could be incredibly relevant in a modern context. So these concepts, decoloniality and Ubuntu, which, as I said, are very much kind of the sort of catchphrases and the issues of the moment. And, you know, we're not just jumping onto a bandwagon of catchphrases here, but they're very, very instrumental, really deep-rooted ideas that need to be brought to the fore. So we can reimagine animal protectionism, we can reimagine animal welfare, but what does it actually mean? So if we talk about a decolonized animal welfare system or a decolonized animal protection movement, what are we talking about? What's it going to look like? How do we apply these lenses of decoloniality and Ubuntu to transform this movement? So since colonialism created division and separation and hierarchy between humans and other animals, if you want to decolonize, the first thing you've got to do is to challenge the hierarchy, the separation, and the division. Because the politics of decolonization is to disrupt. So the first thing would be to dismantle colonialism and white supremacy to address animal oppression and animal liberation. So you think, what has colonialism and white supremacy got to do with animal welfare? Everything, if you look at its history and its current manifestation. So these power apparatuses have to be disrupted in order to move into a decolonial animal future. We've got to look at the laws, policies, beliefs, and practices that are anthropocentric and steeped in colonial history and challenge those. And when you start to do that, you see that the very notion of animal protectionism and animal welfare it came about during the colonial era, and also spoke about the separation, because in terms of this colonial understanding, there was this us and them, us that cared for animals because we were civilized and advanced, and them that did not. And the first step is to challenge this dichotomy. So decolonization then becomes, in some ways, the responsibility of anyone who's concerned about social justice, whatever that might mean. And it's not impossible to see animal protectionism as as part of a social justice movement, and to see non-human animals as one of the many oppressed others. And in no way does this mean that we equate experiences when we draw parallels. We're just trying to show how all these oppressions, whether they be the oppression of nature, the oppression of humans, or the oppression of animals, all stem from the same colonial origin. So therefore, to address any of these oppressions, we've got to go back to those roots. So social justice activism must address colonial and speciesist oppression. And we need to use the social justice lens to extend our sphere of concern. And when we do this, we see that animal welfare has to expand the narrow notion of well-being and start to include social justice issues like gender, sexual diversity, racial equity, economic and housing security, disability rights, environmentalism, etc., etc. All these battles need to be integrated and seen as part and parcel of animal protectionism, because it's these very things that lead to the lack of protection to animals. These things are very much closely linked. So by addressing disparities and building relationships and forming linkages with other social movements and other activists fighting for social justice, it is hoped that animal protectionism can be reframed as not being the preserve of a particular demographic, which unfortunately it predominantly is. So an intersectional animal ethic that also includes anti-racist struggles and gender equality, etc., needs to emerge. Because as I said to you, unfortunately, and I'm not sure that this is only in South Africa, but the animal protection movement is very biased against other races. It really is. It's dominated by white middle-class women predominantly. And any other demographic is judged accordingly. And I mean, as I said, it might be specific to South Africa, but I suspect it's not. I suspect that animal welfare organizations everywhere are dominated by white middle-class women. I don't know. I'm just assuming. So there needs to be, there are disparities. So therefore, historically excluded populations need to be included, and white experiences which have been prioritized need to be challenged, and experiences from those that have been excluded need to come to the fore. So we've got to reimagine, we've got to create a framework to reimagine this sector to become more inclusive. Because only by making it more inclusive are we going to help the animals at the end of the day, which, as I said to you, is my agenda. So by developing relationships with intersectional communities and developing relationships and networking with organizations that are involved in human struggles, this is the way forward for the animal protection movement. Because remember, that's its origins. Animal protectionism evolved in the context of other social movements. So it then would make sense, if you want to not only transform the movement, but you actually want to move it forward, you've got to go back to its real roots, not its imagined roots, what people think its roots is. And yes, the status quo is going to be disrupted, but more linkages are going to be formed at the end of the day. And it's not going to only happen through legal reform, it's also going to be happening through people's everyday imaginings. And I mean, we spoke a little bit about this during the masterclass, whereby if you went into any township in South Africa right now, if you've got my inclination, the first thing you're going to see is just like masses of animals. all free roaming, dogs going exactly where they like. And this is completely deliberate. I've done lots of research speaking to African people about the way they keep dogs. And I'm sorry if this is being repetitive to you, but I would like to repeat this here. And their response to me has always been quite directly, no. They say to me, you white people, you are cruel. And I would be taken back and I'd say, what do you mean? You know, what do you mean? And they'd say, look at your dogs. They say, your dogs are locked up all day in gardens where they cannot go anywhere. And you feed them all this fake food and you sterilize them and they can do nothing. You guys are cruel. Look at our dogs. Our dogs they don't even have fences. They can go where they like. They can visit who they like. They can hang around with other dogs and they can go find their food according to their preference. Are we being cruel or are you being cruel? And that completely really made me think, because intrinsic to all animal welfare organizations is this idea that there's a desirable way of keeping dogs. And this desirable way is confining them, keeping them away from their own kind, feeding them expensive foods that have got no semblance whatsoever to what they would eat naturally. And it really started me thinking. And all these dogs that you see in the township, none of them are stray. So we would think they're stray because they're all running around. And then you find out and you do some reading that what they call community dogs, whatever, most dogs in the world live like this. Only a minority of dogs are living in homes where they've been bought special food and been pampered and treated in a particular way. So this is how most dogs live. And certainly in African townships, this is how dogs live. And people couldn't even imagine letting their dogs live any other way. But problematically, we now have bylaws, and the bylaws themselves are premised on certain assumptions. And these bylaws now make it illegal for dogs to roam free. So as a consequence, when law enforcement pick up dogs that are stray, a disproportionate number of these dogs are going to come from poorer Black communities. So you can see and then those dogs end up in shelters and nobody claims them because people don't even know how. So those dogs will then get euthanized. So you can see how the injustice through the bylaws that's actually been leveled against dogs owned by African people, because the bylaws, which have their roots in colonial management of the cities, because dogs were seen as a potential urban problem by the British, mostly because of rabies. And remember, according to this worldview, only African dogs had rabies. White people's dogs never got rabies. So we had to control African people's dogs because they were the big threat to society and the settler state. So the bylaws themselves, even though it was not their intention, actually end up perpetuating these entrenched inequalities, and disproportionately the dogs belonging to African people and colored people in the Western Cape, these are the dogs that are actually falling foul of the system. So if you want to decolonize animal welfare, one of the things you've got to do is go and re-examine these bylaws, which have just been enacted, and that's not going to go down very well. So another thing is to challenge people's ideas about dogs that are desirable and undesirable, because during the colonial era, this is when dog breeding and dog fancy became so popular, and a hierarchy then emerged within dogs, with pedigree dogs being at the top and sort of mixed breed dogs being at the bottom. As a result, you can kind of see how this is sort of been taken on by all groups in society. So what really shocked me was that when I did this work predominantly in Khayelitsha, which is the biggest township in Cape Town, I was so shocked by the most popular dogs were these colonial dogs. So here you got townships, but people are keeping boerboels. And I mean, the word boerboel, the name boerboel itself gives you some idea of what this is, the boer dog that was there to guard white homesteads against the swart gevaar, or the black threat. Yet it's Black people that are now buying boerboels, which to me was so incongruous. And at the same time, you've got this African dog, the Canis africanus, which is completely seen as like the lowest level of dog, but there's been a resurgence in its popularity amongst white middle-class people. So you've got white middle-class people buying African dogs and African people buying Boer dogs. It's a really weird thing, but this is what's happening. As I said, we're also seeing Black initiated and led animal welfare. And this, of course, will challenge these very negative attitudes that exist towards human others within animal welfare circles. As I said, it's no secret that very, very racist ideas with regard to the treatment of animals by others who are not part of the dominant group is enacted and perpetuated in South Africa. So this kind of racial hierarchy with regard to keeping animals needs to be challenged, and the only way it's going to be challenged and is being challenged is by grassroots organizations emerging, run by Black people themselves, not this white people coming into townships and saying to Black people, you're not looking after your dogs properly, we're going to take them away from you. Because that's kind of the history of South Africa. Black people in South Africa have got a long history of keeping dogs. No matter what former President Zuma said, keeping dogs is not un-African, it's very much African. But the difference is that, the key issue is that colonial governments and apartheid governments have made it policy to basically prevent African people from owning dogs. And even by violently going in and mass extermination of African people's dogs. So as a result, there's quite a lot of negativity associated with animal welfare organizations in the townships, because the collective shared history of African people is about white people coming in, taking your dogs or killing your dogs, because African people were deemed unfit and their dogs got rabies, remember, not white dogs, and African people's dogs were also a threat to the environment because they hunted with them. Never mind hunting being definitely almost the exclusive domain of white males. African people's hunting was problematic because dogs were used, and it led to really violent interactions between the apparatus of state and Black people's dogs. And this residue of distrust exists even today. So apart from challenging these bylaws, and apart from challenging, well, even the bigger laws that govern the country, I think, to me, the most significant way to transform animal welfare is to start to link, to start making people think of animals as part of, well, particularly domestic animals, pets, as part of broader concern of the social welfare system. So at the moment in South Africa, animals fall under the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture. You can see the contradiction. Agriculture is all about the exploitative use of animals. So how on earth can agriculture be the department in charge of animal welfare? There are people who are arguing that it should be part of environmental affairs because they've got a misguided notion that animal protection and environmentalism emerge side by side. You've got still others who are arguing that animal protectionism should be part of the Department of Justice because it's about injustice. I would argue that animal protectionism needs to be part of the Department of Social Welfare because of this shared history. And if you can see pets, for example, as forming part of the social welfare system, due to their overpopulation, but also their therapeutic effect on human mental health, and we can operate a system pretty much like the child foster system that we have in South Africa at the moment, but not funded by government, maybe funded by private donors, maybe we can prevent so many animals from being surrendered and put to sleep. But of course, this is also not something that's going to gain traction with animal welfare organizations, because the SPCA, for example, is completely opposed to the fostering of animals. So that's another matter entirely. So I'm arguing that keeping an animal, keeping a pet, is not a right or a privilege. It's something that everybody should be able to do, and it shouldn't be determined whether just because you're rich and can afford to do it, it's okay. It's something that everybody, it's not a privilege. And we keep hearing this. People keep saying, owning an animal is a privilege, it's not a right. And they shouldn't have them if they can't look after them. It's the same argument that people use against poor people having lots of children. They shouldn't have them if they can't afford them. And I think that sentence alone is the thing that we've got to take away. They shouldn't have them if they can't afford them. My attitude is, if they do have them, and if they can't afford them, your job as an animal protection organization or an animal welfare organization is to offer support so they can have them, instead of judging and taking away and actually adding to the problem. So pet care should be part of social services supported by society and welfare organizations, and by rekindling these historic links with human and child welfare, we might be able to make this idea more palatable. I would also like to see a situation, and I'm probably going to incur the wrath of social workers everywhere, that social workers need to become more involved. Because the way I look at it is, let's say you've got an organization like the SPCA, which is the biggest. You've got somebody that's coming in that can't look after their animal. They come to the SPCA, they say, can you take this animal from me? I can't look after it anymore. The SPCA prides itself on the fact that they don't ask any questions. So anybody feels comfortable bringing them an animal that they don't want, because they're not going to ask questions. They're just going to take the animal and put it to sleep. And I'm like, that's exactly the wrong approach. Ask questions. The more questions you ask, the more you are able to identify why this problem exists in the first place. So social workers in South Africa have to do internships. So I'm thinking, if these social workers, and they struggle to find places to do their internships, if these interns could maybe be sent to the SPCA and work there, so somebody comes in, they don't want their animal. This person then gets referred to the social worker, who does a bit of probing. The social worker finds out this person doesn't want this animal because they've lost their job, or they don't want this animal because they can't afford to buy food at the moment, but it's temporary, or they've got a temporary housing problem. The social worker can then draw on their networks and assist this family by applying for a grant or subsidized accommodation or whatever, and in the process, prevent the animal from being surrendered, because you're addressing the root cause of the animal surrender, which is essentially a human social problem. Similarly with domestic violence shelters, we all know that studies have been done that show that many women don't leave their homes where they're being abused because they don't know what to do with their dogs or cats, because they know that the abuser already has and will abuse that animal if they leave it. The same used to be the situation with children, and then these domestic shelters used to now allow women to bring their children. They don't even have to build kennels or have their own facilities. All they need to do is form linkages with organizations that shelter animals, so that if a woman wants to leave her husband, but she doesn't want to leave her dog behind, they can then facilitate a place for the dog to go so the woman can leave the abusive home. It just takes looking at the issue a little bit differently and forming linkages between groups and organizations that have actually been opposed to one another, even though they don't realize they're fighting for a similar cause. So a support-based model of animal welfare is what we need to promote. So if people can no longer care for their dog because they don't have food to feed the dog, or their dog's roaming free and they don't have a fence to keep the dog in, whatever the problem is, if some of those funds that are being used to kill these animals en masse could be redirected to assist families in need, that might be a way of, initially on a small scale, by preventing the amount of animals that people are giving up because they can no longer care for them. Also, not just accepting every animal that people are handing in. Maybe, and I think COVID taught us this triage system whereby you can maybe decide, this is a code red, this animal's in danger, take it in immediately. Or if it's a code orange, it's not really in danger, we can send that animal home and maybe help the owner to find a new home for the animal from their home and not have to have it come into our kennels where another animal has to lose its life. If it's a green, then the animal might not need to be handed over at all. It might just be this family just needs their animal to be sterilized, because with the new bylaws, with the new bylaws, you have to have your animals sterilized. People can't afford it. So if you made sterilization free, you could prevent a lot of surrenders. And by recognizing the disparities in animal care and bonding and using social workers, I believe we can start to solve the problem on a different level. Because in a country plagued with myriad social and animal welfare concerns, drawing on an African-based, non-hierarchical and potentially unifying ethos, like Ubuntu, presents us with an opportunity to develop solutions and interventions to alleviate multiple problems simultaneously, because the roots of animal protectionism are intricately linked to child and other social welfare concerns, and restoring this connection has never been more pressing than it is today. That's it.